You are listening to Anisua Works. Side dish. I arrived at the address my boss texted me right on time. It was a very crisp morning. It had rained the day before and the atmosphere felt so fresh and clean. The birds were out chirping and I felt like I was driving into a storybook when I arrived at the manor. I had heard the Aillen Manor had 26 rooms, a rooftop vineyard, and a stable the size of 2 football fields. I thought that to be a wild exaggeration, but seeing truly was believing. As I walked towards the familiar green company van, I could make out Kathy, Dylan, and Pearl, with whom I worked. I gave each one of them a hug, and it was clear to see that we were all giddy. Our gig at Aillen Manor was by a stretch the largest we had secured since any of us started working at the catering company, Gem Tang. We catered all sorts of public and private events, from those as wild as grand 9-day wedding ceremonies to those as simple as intimate christenings. Our boss was Lola Carmen, a soul food whiz who was equally as good at many other styles of cooking. She was always at least 2 hours earlier than the first of us to arrive, and she was the most hands-on employer I have ever worked for. The event we were catering that day was for an icon in our community. In addition to being the matriarch of the Aillen family, Doreen Aillen was a stellar doctor. Born into wealth and privilege beyond any stretch of the imagination, Doreen had had no reason to lift a finger in work. However, the millionaire's doctor had an innate love and curiosity for the human body that drove her to study medicine and to practice it. Doreen, who was then unmarried, raked up a fortune herself from practicing as a physician. She met her husband, Glenn Aillen, of equally astronomical wealth, in Jamaica while on charity work. The two were married within a month, and that day we were at the manor to cater an intimate 30-person dinner in celebration of their silver jubilee. We barely had to bring any equipment with us. There were 4 huge kitchens and all manner of equipment available, some of which I had never seen before. At our disposal was a team of waiters and cleaning staff. That really was a dream gig. For the better part of that afternoon, I did nothing but chop, fry, taste, and repeat. I must have peeled a million cloves of garlic, and my white apron grew to resemble a colorful flag. Passion is an amazing thing because it fueled me throughout the most tedious of days, of which that night easily topped. When we were able to get all our prep for service done, I relaxed a bit. Everything looked great so far. Lola was so pleased that she gave us all a 10-minute break to get some air that did not smell like spice, and we all took it. That was when I walked out onto the kitchen's balcony and saw the magnificent canopies being set up. I never thought I would use the word magnificent to describe anything until I saw those canopies. They must have stood tens of feet high, giant white canopies against the sprawling and lush green lawn that must have been mowed by the wave of a magic wand. Servants dressed in uniform paraded to and fro, preparing to receive the guests as they began to arrive. It was such extravagance for such few guests. I wished I were one of them, casually strolling about in the crisp, fresh air with a cocktail in hand. As I found out, 10 minutes goes by even faster when you're daydreaming, and I soon had to return to reality and the kitchen. I tasted the marinade on the prawns Kathy had worked on to make sure they could go on the grill, and they were great. Dylan had already set up the grill, and all that was left to do was to lay the gorgeous parsley and marmalade marinated prawns on. I grabbed the large tray atop which the prawns rested and headed out back for the grill, while my boss and the other 3 worked on getting the entrees ready for service. The prawns were a huge part of the salad we would serve our appetizers with, and so I had to be very careful with getting them just right. I laid them all on and set the timer for 2.5 minutes. I tried to see the grounds where it was going down, but a bunch of trees were in my way. Suddenly, music started to play. It sounded like an orchestra. Now I really wished I could see. I attempted to climb one of the trees but soon realized I was no squirrel. I abandoned the mission and was immediately aware of a man who was walking towards me. My eyes met that of a tall, medium-built man in eyeglasses. He was dressed in black long-sleeved shirt and navy blue shorts. His shoes looked expensive, and I could smell his cologne from that distance away, even with the prawns going. He had the most intense eyes behind those glasses, and he looked right at me as he approached. I thought of how wretched I must look in that dirty apron, blue hairnet, and kitchen boots. Then I thought about how dapper this man looked and smelled. "Stop!" I blurted out. He froze. "What's happening?" "I'm sorry for startling you, sir, but you smell really good and there's nothing but smoke this way," I said. "Oh, thanks. I hate to admit it, but I'm lost. I used one of the bathrooms and I'm trying to get back there," he said, pointing to the canopies. I have no idea how to get there unless you're willing to go through more food," I said, pointing towards the kitchen. He shook his head wildly, causing me to smile. "You don't work here?" he asked, puzzled. "Not permanently. I'm with the catering company here for tonight," I answered. "Right. Thanks," he said, with a wink, as he headed back the way he had come. I watched him till he disappeared behind a marble pillar. Suddenly, the lights of the manor came on as dusk hit. I gasped. The mansion looked 1,000,000 times more beautiful with the lights. I felt like I was really in a fairy tale. I would have drifted farther off into my daydream, but the timer went off and gave me a rude awakening. I finished off the prawns and headed back into the kitchen. The amazing aroma that greeted me when I walked into the kitchen was one I am supposed to be used to, but that gets me every time. I set the prawns down and got to making the salad for appetizers. The plan was to have 2 options for appetizers and entrees and 3 dessert options. All 5 of us in that grand kitchen were great cooks and very experienced. We barely said much to each other, but knew exactly what to do so that the vision for each dish came to fruition. One of the butlers announced to us that the guests were seated and done with their cocktails. That meant it was showtime. Servers bustled about with bottles of wine that had been brought out of an underground cellar in the mansion. I was fascinated at the seamless display of wealth, and I felt so proud to have landed a job that came with such an experience. My prawn and arugula salads flew out, and so did Pearl's deep-fried stuffed calamari. We immediately shifted our attention back to the mains, but we were all on edge to see the plates return. Just in time, our spicy pork chops and tuna tartare entrees were ready for service. The servers returned with plates from the appetizers in a perfect queue, and one after the other, the plates were empty. We gave each other quick words of encouragement and kept our fingers crossed that our mains would be as much of a hit. With desserts ready to go, chocolate and hazelnut pudding, pistachio panna cotta or cheesecake, and a summer berries reduction, we watched the plates for the mains return. It was such a rewarding feeling to see the mains were almost completely gone. I mean, people ate everything. It was another win that put us in a very good mood. The greatest part of this gig was that we did not have to clean up after ourselves. Our jobs were done once the desserts were out, but we waited to see whether anything would be sent back to the kitchen. 30 minutes later, the servers returned, and guess what? It was a trifecta. The dessert bowls were cleaned out. We shared a group hug and were all very pleased. We had done Gem Tongue proud. The butler returned moments later with a message from our boss for the night, Doreen. She, her husband, and the guests were so impressed by our cooking that they were demanding to see us. All of us looked down at our messy aprons. We knew it was not a good look. Before we could raise a concern about our appearance, the butler gestured for us to follow him. I was glad he walked with us because 10 seconds into the walk, I had lost my bearing. The manor was grand indeed. The 5 of us followed him into a room at the end of a corridor. He swung the door open, and suddenly we were at Paris Fashion Week. The room was bigger than the giant kitchen we had just worked from, and it was essentially a giant wardrobe. Clothes, jewelry, shoes, bags, perfumes, and hats were everywhere. The Lord and Lady of the Manor receive uncountable gifts, many of which they can afford themselves. This room is dedicated to keeping these items until they can be given out to charity, the butler explained in his fancy voice. He urged us to feel comfortable and find something appropriate to change into. With that instruction, the butler shut the door behind him and left. Every one of us was astonished. We spent about half an hour freshening up and getting ready. I found an air-light emerald green sleeveless dress that fit me like a glove. Soon after, the butler arrived and took us out to the party grounds. We stood on the veranda while we were announced to the guests. As they clapped for us, we all walked down the stairs, dressed like we belonged among them. Their attention soon drifted back to small talk and dancing, but mine stayed on a man who was looking at me too. It was the man from the grill, the one who smelt so good. He had a champagne glass in his hand, and I could tell from the way his eyes were glazed over that he was tipsy at the least. He kept his eyes on me as he drank, and I thought I saw him wink at me. I grabbed a glass of wine, took a long sip, and tried to keep my mind off the man from the grill, but I could not. He was standing with his back to 2 beautiful women who were talking with each other. My heart skipped a beat when he started to walk towards me. My lips parted in awe as he wrapped his arms around me and swooped me into a dance. I had not realized how tall he was until he towered above me as we danced. I felt his hand slip to the small of my back. I grabbed onto him as I swooned, and he pulled me up and close to him. "Are you all right?" he whispered into my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. There was some sort of attraction between us that I cannot describe. I felt like I had known him before that day, and it felt like we had unfinished business. His gaze was so strong, and I found his silence so loud. Everything in me wanted to kiss him, but I was well aware of where I stood. When I thought about the fact that I was technically still at work, I promptly stepped away from him. "It's okay," he said softly, closing the gap between us with another step. "No, it's not. I'm working," I said, fidgeting with my dress. "You've done your job, and very well, I should say. Do you taste as good as your food? You would make an epic side dish," he added with a smirk. There was something about him. I was taken aback by his boldness, and it strangely turned me on. He waited for a reply, but I said nothing. Instead, I gave him a look fueled by pure desire and walked off towards the stairwell. As I took each step, I prayed he would come after me, and when I took a left turn down the hall, he did. I felt like Celine Dion on the set of the video of her song "It's All Coming Back to Me Now," as he followed me farther away from the party and deeper into the mansion. When the loud band music was no more than a rumble in the distance, I found an empty room and went inside. Judging from the different piles of clothes and the sheer amount of pressing irons and laundry baskets, it was no doubt a laundry room. As he caught up with me, the sane part of me wondered what the hell I was doing. I didn't even know this guy, and I was technically still at work. The demon in me spoke up too. "Liv," it said. "It's been 3 weeks since you had sex, and that was with a guy who cried when he climaxed. You deserve this," it said. I started to put my hair back in a bun when he came in. As we crashed into an erotic kiss, he turned the key in the door and made sure we would not be disturbed. I took off his glasses and tossed them onto a table nearby. I found the switch for the lights and flipped them off. The cloak of darkness in itself was an aphrodisiac to me, and it made me hungrier for him. We both knew we did not have much time, and so as much as I wanted to keep kissing him, he turned me around and started to unzip my dress. The zipper got stuck about halfway, and he gave up trying. He lifted me up onto a counter nearby and stood in front of me. I straddled him with my legs as we kissed. His shirt was made from silk, and I could hear him mumble words of encouragement as I took his belt off. I slipped my hand slowly into his pants, and as my fingers traveled downwards, I examined what he was working with. I could feel his excitement for 8 or more impressive inches, and I bit my lip in anticipation of the joyride I was about to take. Just as I pulled him closer and urged him to give me what I needed, he drew back from me. I wondered what was happening and soon found out when he went on his knees and buried his head in my crotch. I gasped as I felt his tongue on my lips that can't speak. If I knew his name, I would have screamed it, because that man's tongue is a blessing. I got so wet, not only from the mind-blowing oral sex, but by how he went about it. His moans of pleasure were intoxicating to me and turned me on so much more. I wished he could stay down there forever, but I needed to get the D. I pulled him up gently onto the top of the counter with me. Hidden in the darkness and surrounded by laundry, he gently slipped inside my welcoming body. We made love for much longer than we should have, first on that counter, then another, and finally entangled in the sheets. His thrust game was so strong, and he had me coming over and over again. We both kept saying that we should probably stop, but neither one of us were willing to actually do it. When the mumble of the band stopped completely, we both knew that we had to head back to the party grounds. I was already mostly clothed, and so waited on my partner in sin to dress up while I fixed my hair. Before we walked out, we shared a passionate, long kiss behind closed doors, but when we stepped out, we never so much as looked at each other. When I finally managed to locate my colleagues, everyone was on the dance floor with wine glasses in hand. Doreen stood in the middle with one of the ladies who earlier on had been standing next to the guy I had just devoured, and it was apparent she was about to make a toast. All of us guests listened intently. Ladies and gentlemen, here tonight are my greatest and most cherished friends and family members, and it is my absolute pleasure to share some exciting news about my daughter, she said, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. My daughter Rose will be marrying the Gregorio family's only son and her longtime boyfriend of 4 years, Luis, in December. Luis, where are you? With loud applause ringing, we all strained to see who this lucky Luis guy was. Across from where I stood, I could see the crowd part as someone walked towards the front. Tall, dark silk shirt, navy blue trousers, and yes, glasses. Luis was my partner in sin. I watched in shock as he stood next to Rose and smiled. He even kissed her with the same lips both my set of lips had just met. If I had told anyone we had just been together, they would have called me a liar. Back at our van, my colleagues inquired where I had vanished to. I told them I had gotten lost and was relieved to find out they bought it. As usual, we would say a prayer in thanks for a successful dinner service and for churning out good food before saying goodbye to one another. I prayed for forgiveness instead. 8 months passed, and I had not forgotten my wild encounter at the Aillen Manor, nor did I feel any less guilty. Gemtang won the contract to cater their wedding, and I can't wait to confront Louise on why he made me a side dish instead of the dish of the day. To be continued.